Let me welcome you to day 2 of our summer seminar. And it's a joy to have with us again Maria, Wolter and Rocco Buttiglione, who were both with us yesterday. I think neither need any further introduction. They are dear friends of the Hildebrand Project and regular contributors to our seminars. Maria has recently become one of our new associated scholars. We're very happy to have you in that capacity, Maria. So this morning we turn to, in this first session, to the theme of affectivity and love. And what you'll see today and tomorrow and really throughout the seminar is just how far-reaching affectivity is. There's not a single dimension of philosophical and theological anthropology that does not involve the affective sphere in a very profound way. And that's one of the things that we're trying to showcase in the way in which these sessions have been developed. So without further ado, I will let Maria speak first, and then we'll hear from Rocco, and again, we'll take questions. And I would just again remind you all that we're taking questions through the question and answer tool, the chat, for you to communicate with each other. So if you want us to see your questions, please put them in the Q&A tool. With that, Maria, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, John Henry. So I'm delighted again to have been asked to present on two of my favorite authors and two of the perhaps greatest books ever written on love, namely The Nature of Love by Hildebrand and Love and Responsibility, but then I'd also like to briefly touch upon the theology of the body. I'd like to begin with an interesting observation that I didn't realize until I was preparing for this session, namely that both of the authors began working on their respective works, masterpieces of love, around the same time in the 50s. Wojtyła was first out of the gate in 1960 with his publication in Polish, and then it took Hildebrand another 11 years, so he didn't come out with Wesen der Liebe until 71. But it's interesting because somehow that timeliness is also very, you find it in their works. There are so many parallels and there's so many points of contact and deep convergence in both of the authors. But there are also some striking tensions, and today I'd like to start with the perhaps most notable and certainly the most commented upon tension, namely regarding the question of the role of the will and the role of the heart in love. So Wojtyła is a representative of that long-standing tradition that we heard more about yesterday, which speaks of love as a free choice, as a commitment of the will to the good of the other. And I think in one of his most profound passages in Love and Responsibility, he talks about how love engages freedom and fulfills freedom with the good. And so how freedom is the means and love is the end for freedom. By contrast, Hildebrand says that, I quote, love is an effective value response. That was in your reading, actually. And even says that love is the most effective value response. And sometimes comments like this, and also his incredibly enthusiastic, passionate, emphatic, and almost exclusive focus on the nature of affectivity seem to suggest, and to many have been indicative, that he sees love as primarily an effective response or purely even as an effective response. And that is the question that I want to look at, because I don't think that that actually does him justice. So for example, if you take his declaration that love is an effective value response, which is made right at the beginning of chapter 2, it's situated in the context, again, of his attempt to show that we miss something if all we do is absorb affectivity into a broad notion of the will. So for him, it's simply not enough that all of the elements can be found again, but just under the guise of the will. The whole purpose and the task of philosophy is to go ever more deeply into experiences and to define things ever more clearly. And so for him, this is a big stumbling block. And I think one of the reasons why he spends so much time trying to work out the nature of affectivity. And so if you take freedom, broadly speaking, its two most essential characteristics, you could say the first is, well, freedom is in its essence, my ability to make a choice, but not to have to make the choice. And there are sort of two dimensions of this. The one is, and I say this with sort of a careful hesitation, the creative part, yes, because this, there would be a whole nother discussion with the medievalists on this, but it's basically my ability to initiate, my ability to execute, to control something or not to control something. So you ought and you will exist or you will not exist, that ability of freedom. So that kind of more active controlling aspect of freedom, even though control, I don't like that word either. Creative in some sense is better. And then the second one is one that's been disregarded a lot under the guise of liberty. John Locke, I think, was very responsible for that in part, but this is the cooperative dimension of freedom. And so the cooperative dimension means that it's my ability to embrace, to reject, to turn away from, to turn towards, yes, to deny or to affirm something that's already given. Given, like, for example, the good or the moral law or my skin color, the circumstances of my life, even my own person. So this is the fundamental dimension of freedom for Kierkegaard. I can even reject myself. That's the power of freedom. And if you look at these two, so the controlling and the cooperative dimension of freedom, Hildebrand's point is affectivity simply doesn't fit into either of these dimensions of free will. So spiritual affectivity, and we made those distinctions yesterday, so I'm not going to repeat those now again, but spiritual affectivity precisely stands out, obviously, that it cannot be executed or initiated or controlled so often. I mean, it would be great if I were a single person and I found a beautiful and good person of the other sex and I said, well, I will fall in love with you, but that's simply not how affectivity works. It's elusive, right? Or, for example, if I have a negative feeling, it would be wonderful if somehow I could control that and say no to it, and it would just simply disappear as easily as it is to do something as if I didn't have that negative feeling, for example, in the face of the success of a loved one. And then yesterday we spoke, for example, about the dark night of the soul and that whole vacuum of the feelings and how we have that experience that the will has to step forward, but feels that something important and different is missing that helps also carry it. So it doesn't fit into clearly the first dimension of freedom. So what about the cooperative dimension of freedom? I mean, could we put affectivity there? And I mean, after all, right, we did say yesterday that spiritual affections are stances that we give to things that are already given. And Hildebrand in his ethics works out that both affective and volitional responses respond to the positive or the negative importance of something. And yet that doesn't make sense either, because Hildebrand says that my experience of the will is precisely that it needs to cooperate with my affection. So with what is given in affectivity. And we spoke of that yesterday. So my will needs to sanction the good feelings or disavow the bad feelings, indirectly influence. And that'd be very strange if all of that were in the will. So the will somehow were cooperating and turning against something else that's happening in the dimension of the will. So clearly here, we can't simply absorb the richness and the fullness of spiritual affectivity into the notion of free will, yeah? Which I think is different from freedom as such. Like, freedom is broader. So I'm talking here now specifically about the will. Another big problem and the only reason I'm not going into what sanctioning, disavowing, and indirectly influencing mean is because we spoke about that yesterday. So you would find that in yesterday's panels. Now, another big thing for Hildebrand that stands out and is an important characteristic that shows us that affectivity, in fact, again, is distinct from freedom, is this, what he calls the gift character of affectivity. And there are two dimensions of this gift character that are very important for him. The one is the kind of gift character of the affections themselves. They arise in us, they are given, they are present, yes? They simply happen. So again, we see there's not this activity of that we find in the will, but there is a receptivity and a kind of an undergoing a kind of an affection, even though it's a personal stance, but it's not something that I have that immediate control over. And the fact that they are given in a way that surpasses anything that we could even imagine or achieve ourselves. And this is something that I find very intriguing. So I used to be a very big proponent of the idea that love was in fact an act of the will, primarily, if not purely. I almost committed myself to that for the rest of my life until I actually met my beloved, as in my now husband. And that was a very striking difference for me, where all of a sudden this new dimension that occurs when affectivity, that the affective dimension of love kicks in, and how much more that is and how stunning it is, because you're precisely overwhelmed and confronted with the fact that the love is so great that you receive it almost as a gift that you can't have given yourself. Yeah, I think another time when this really hit home to me was at the birth of my children. So kind of funny fact, I never really, I mean, I like children, but I didn't love children in the sense of, you know, some people, they love other children and then they can't wait. And that was never really my experience. And so I was a little worried if I would be able to love my children. But then that experience, and again, I thought of it in terms of an act of the will. And my experience was, you know, I thought, okay, well, I hope I can will to love my child enough. But then at the birth of this child, where all of a sudden, this gift of love that is just so great, you know, on the affective dimension. And then with the second child, where you begin to wonder, oh my goodness, can I love them equally, etc. And then there's yet such a new gift of love. So, and that goes on and on with each further child, and where this is very important, says Hildebrand, I think, in our day and age, to recognize that there's an element of our being that is so deeply characterized by gift that we would lose a sense of a very important, so we would actually lose a sense of something essential in metaphysics, our understanding of being itself, if we ignored affectivity. I'll come back to that maybe a little bit later. And so this surplus of feelings, this is what I think Hildebrand means when he talks about as an essential characteristic of love, when he says love is the most effective value response. He's very clear there, not that love is only an effective response. That is not what he's saying. He's saying it's the most effective. And this is beautiful because he says it's a whole new level of spiritual affectivity. It's a whole new dimension. It can not even be compared to the appreciative affective responses, he calls them, which are the lowest kind, or the narrow affective responses. But in love, there is such a surplus and so much more is given that it's almost incomparable. Okay, so this, even if we were to do everything right with our will, there's still a sense, there's still an experience that we could not give the depth of, for example, my sorrow or my, you know, my compunction in the face of my sins, my contrition, if I did it myself, if it were up to me. But then there's another element of this gift character, and this is another essential reason why Hildebrand says love cannot simply be an act of the will. And where he talks about this gift in love, in the affectivity of love, has to do with the gift of self. Yeah. So when our heart is engaged, there's a whole new level of the engagement, investment, commitment of self. When my heart is in it, I am completely in it myself. Yeah? The fullness of me, every aspect of me. And so we certainly are also in it when we commit with our will. And that's a very important being in it, as staying true to an oath or to a promise, staying true to a commitment, etc. But when the voice of the heart, is what Hildebrand calls it, joins this commitment of the will, he says the experience is such that you realize that the will alone wouldn't have the power to activate this level of self-donation, self-gift. And so a whole new aspect emerges through affectivity. Again, that is different. And that's why we use different language. When I say, I commit to you, or I will your good, versus I give you my heart, or I love you fully. I mean, in the discussion yesterday, you know, when scripture is full of references to the heart, and Thomas and also actually John Paul II, when he speaks of scripture, uses the language of the heart more. And it seems to me very telling, and this is something that I appreciate in Hildebrand, where he says, well, if we use the language and if we don't use the same word, then why would we use a new word? Well, it must mean that there's something different, distinctive in it that we would lose otherwise. So there is this sense in which the heart is a deeper part of myself, which Father James said that that the Thomists would not object to, in the sense of there's a more interior part of me in that. So, but there is also this more. It is another new dimension, and Hildebrand insists on that, and that's why he does focus so much on affectivity. But if you return to the question then, so, well, in the face of all of this, is love then merely an effective response? Well, clearly it's not. I mean, you don't even have to just read The Nature of Love, but when you read all of his writings, in The Nature of Love alone, repeatedly, he says love requires both dimensions, the voice of the heart, but also the yes spoken by the free center. And so he says love remains incomplete if it is not sanctioned. If the voice of the heart is not there, then the personal center has to activate the will, especially if it's in a relationship of commitment, for example, marriage. Yes. So there, the personal center has to activate the will, and yet I feel that this is not the fullness of love. I feel that there could be more, and oftentimes that's very painful, especially in marriage. And that's the whole purpose of the sanctioning, isn't it? Because the will has the purpose to engage, jumpstart, regulate, channel, keep alive, make sure that it stays steadfast, etc., the heart. And if the will doesn't do that, then the heart, I mean, for marriage especially, I think in our experience of marriage, I mean, if we don't try to keep the affections alive, they, in many marriages, do disappear. The problem is if all we say is love is a matter of just the affections, then obviously, well, if the affections are gone, well, then love is done. And this is what Karol Wojtyła is so concerned with, but also Hildebrand. No, the will is also a dimension of love. The will has to be there, and it has to step up to the plate if affectivity somehow becomes defective or vanishes. And it has to be reignited, and that's a possibility. I can reignite it. So love is the most perfect value response for Hildebrand, precisely. He doesn't do himself a service with much of his language and with his focus, but if you read his whole work from beginning to end, love is the most perfect value response because love involves the totality of the person. So it involves reason, and this is quoting from The Nature of Love. The objectivity of love consists in the adequacy of the response, which can only be provided by a critical examination of reason. The more the good is understood, the better and fuller my love will be, my effective response will be. So reason is vital. It has to be there. Then, of course, the will, we talked about that in the sanctioning and disavowing and indirectly influencing, etc., is critical in its many practical dimensions. And then the heart. So it involves the totality of the person. I'm reminded here of an image where Socrates speaks of, you know, man, and he has the winged chariot, the two winged horses and the chariot. And if one of them is in imbalance, then everything crashes and man will somehow die and disappear. And in some sense, I think that you could, and the image doesn't do it justice because they all seem distinct, like separate, which they aren't, right? But somehow you have three things. You have reason and heart and will, And then you have man, because they're all a part of me. It's not one part that's rational, one part, but they're all in me, and they have to maintain a balance and a full integration. Otherwise, this becomes a big problem. It's the most perfect value response also because it is appropriately, love has to be directed at a person, not just an object. Yeah. So love wants to be heard, and it wants to be requited, and it doesn't just want union, it wants to commune with the beloved. So it takes union to a whole nother level. It goes beyond just giving an adequate response or a response that somebody deserves. It gives a surplus, it gives a more, because it gives me as well. Yeah. And thereby it completes and it perfects me as the individual. It keeps me intact and yet enriches me and allows me to transcend. So this nature of love in Hildebrand is very rich, and certainly cannot be limited to just the affectivity of the response. And so now the question is, well, what about Wojtyła? In Wojtyła, right, if I place his statements in a greater context, does he also have room for the affectivity in love, for the affective dimension of love? And it's fascinating because when you start reading Love and Responsibility, right in the beginning, when he talks about and distinguishes between pleasure and pain, you think he and Hildebrand, even though they never spoke to each other during the writing of it, that I'm aware, yes, seem to completely parallel each other, because he says, for example, he divides it and says there's or sensual pain, so bodily feelings. There's affective contentment and affective discontentment, the psychic feelings maybe in Hildebrand. And then there's deep and thorough joy and deep sorrow, spiritual feelings. So in some sense, he seems to start heading in that direction, but he doesn't. In my opinion, and I'm very excited to hear, Rocco, your opinion on this, in Love and Responsibility, I don't think he takes it any further. As a matter of fact, I feel as though he almost backtracks a little bit in Love and Responsibility, because in his section on the psychological analysis of love, when he speaks about the two emotional factors that are part of the makeup of conjugal love, so he talks about sensuality and sentiment. Sensuality is attracted to the sexual values into the body. So again, bodily feelings, yes, if you were to draw a parallel. And then in sentiment, he uses language that sounds so much like what Hildebrand says. So he says it reacts to, I quote, value, yes? The deeper the value, the deeper the emotion. It's attracted to the whole person, he says at a certain point. But then he develops it and he says the whole person, but in their masculinity and femininity. And so he, I think then as he continues to develop it, says affectivity cannot get away from the subjective element. It has the propensity to idealize and not to hold on what is real. And it focuses, he says, on the masculinity and femininity and not on the uniqueness of the person. And then there's another moment, the fondness, when in the metaphysical analysis, he speaks of the fondness of love. Yeah? And surely he's speaking of an affection here. I even spoke with some Polish friends and I asked them to translate the word for me. And I said, this cannot possibly be correctly translated with everything that follows from this. And they said, well, no, it's reflexive. And it's something that happens to me, not something that I choose. Yes. And so when he speaks of fondness, he talks about, like Hildebrand, a cognitive moment. It arises in the face of value, and it considers the beauty of the whole person, but it's a willing commitment. And so again, he goes, and for Wojtyła, at least in Love and Responsibility, it's so important for him that love does not get stuck in the subjective. It has to move into the objective, and it does that through reason and will. So will makes it other-centered, yes? Will points the affections with a view to the good of the other. And of course, Hildebrand and Wojtyła agree in this. The will is necessary for longevity. It's necessary for the completeness of love. Yes, It's impossible to have love without truth and without free commitment. So in this, they are completely like-minded. But I think the difference is then the disagreement here, at least in these two works, occurs that for Wojtyła, the emotion is not truly spiritual in the way that Hildebrand has been describing. And for Hildebrand, affectivity is capable of grasping the truth and not, it doesn't simply by its very nature idealize, yes? And it's deeply personal. Already the affection is deeply personal. Now, I will end. I realize I've come to the end because I think that John Paul II, especially in the theology of the body, which is really, I think, his continuation, the maturation of what he's written in Love and Responsibility. And there, I think he does much more justice. He has that whole section on, is the heart accused or called by Christ? And he has to grapple with the fact that Christ centers some of his central teaching passages on the heart. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they will see God. Yes? The man who desires another woman in his heart has committed, or desires another woman has committed adultery in his heart. So it's all heart-centered, and John Paul II delves into that. And in the process, he investigates desire, eros, yes? And he goes back and he says, for the Greeks, this was the ability to transcend to the true, the beautiful, and the good, or to delve down and then become concupiscent in Catholic terminology, has to be sort of turned inward. And he says what we have to hold on to is that it has the ability, it's important, and it can lead us up to what is higher. And when he begins to talk about his really long section on how do we achieve a purity of heart, how do we maintain that of the, or regain that of the heart, yes, how do we move away from what misdirects our affectivity and our desire? He says, in line with Hildebrand, like you could now parallel and bridge it very beautifully, I think. He says, well, the first thing is reason. Reason has to understand and it has to know, and he has that beautiful, the power of the mystery of creation becomes the power of the mystery of redemption. If we don't understand what it was, we won't understand what it's meant to be, yes? So the power of knowledge. And then with purity of the heart, there's the active dimension of freedom, which is self-mastery and abstinence. That's how I achieve it. But then also where he talks about the gift character of purity, and where he says that it is something that is also given to me. It is something that I have to be open to. I have to be willing to receive, yes? And if I open myself up to it, then it appears kind of like a gift in me. And I think that goes back to what Beth was saying yesterday. So in any case, my apologies, I think I went over time, but I think that the two could very well be bridged and would perfectly complement each other if one worked it out more. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that, as well as what you were going to say, Rocco.
Very well, Maria. Thank you. But you must think that Wojtyła has a complex personality. He's a Polishman, and in the time of his studies in Poland, one dominating school of thought was that of deontological logics. Deontological logics, at least in the form that it takes in one of the professors that were more influential with Wojtyła at a certain point, Jerzy Kalinowski, is more or less this. Human reason sees that God has made us, and we are dependent upon God. And to God, our love is due. And then you have the possibility of deducing from our dependency from God a set of commandments, of laws that we must accept and to which we must obey. They are the laws of nature. The human moral activity consists chiefly in the obedience to law. I imagine that von Hildebrand would not have been very happy with this. Here, however, there is a modification introduced by Wojtyła. There is this deontological tradition that, by the way, is similar to that of a large part of Thomism also out of Poland. And there is the Carmelite spirituality of Wojtyła, St. John of the Cross. Nobody can be possessed of the true love of God until he has divested himself of the love of all created beings. To divest yourself of the love of all created beings means practically that you give up all the world of affections. So the ethics that is the result of this vision between Kalinowski, Garrigou-Lagrange, yesterday we quoted Garrigou-Lagrange, no, we didn't, does not matter. And the St. John of the Cross is a theory of a spiritual, an affective void, the night of the soul. To this, you must add other elements of Polish history. Friends, heroes, leaders of the struggle against National Socialism, who betrayed, who were broken. The deep experience of the nothingness of man and of all human affections. Of the power, your affections do not resist. And another story that is a story that everybody knows in Poland. It is the story of Queen Jadwiga. Jadwiga was in love. She was the last queen of the Anjou in Krakow, in Poland. And Poland was threatened by the enormous, terrible empire of the Lithuanians. Today, Lithuania is a very small country, but it was then an enormous empire, almost as powerful as the empire of the Mongols, Genghis Khan. And she was in love with an Austrian archduke who later became emperor. I think he was Albert III. And what shall we do? How can a woman defend the kingdom? And then she makes the decision. I shall get married to Jogaila, the terrible leader of the Lithuanians. And I will convert him to Christianity, and we will build a common Rzeczpospolita, a common republic of the Lithuanians and the Poles. And she made the decision to love Jogaila, and she did love him. And he was not so bad as it had been described in the beginning. So you have this very profound tradition of you must add the element of love to God, because the knowledge of truth, shall we say that it is neutral from an affective point of view, or shall we say that there is a profound affection connected with the very act of knowing the truth? And this corresponds to a metaphysical love of God. That is the first and fundamental love. How could this man write Love and Responsibility? I imagine you are asking yourself. Well, he could, because he was a priest, and this kind of spirituality is a clerical spirituality. If we take the distinction of different kinds of spiritualities made by von Balthasar, this is an ecclesiastical style. It is not a lay style. But he was in charge of the university students. And he soon realized that this spirituality did not fit with the experience of the university students. University students discovers in him sexuality, and then he falls in love, and then he needs to be oriented in all the process that is taking place in himself. You cannot ask him to renounce to all of this. You can ask this from a monk, you must, but not from a layman. And then he begins to develop a lay spirituality. The idea that, yes, there is this fundamental love of God, but this fundamental love of God, you can meet him, let us say, face to face, but you can have also another path, a path that goes through all experiences and the lives of this earth, if you can see them in the light of truth. And then you have love and responsibility. So in Wojtyła, it is a very strong idea that it may happen that you have to make a decision against your affectivity. Truth may ask you to perform an act that runs against all the demands of your heart, if you take the heart in the sense of the realm of affectivity. And what is the great example? Jesus Christ on the cross. His cry to the Father, why did you abandon me? Why did you leave me? Everything is against me. This is the servant of Yahweh, of Isaiah. No? I remain faithful to truth against all odds, against my very heart. And nevertheless, this cannot be a pedagogical ideal, because the affectivity is a powerful force in man, and without the strength of the affectivity, without the impulse of the affectivity, well, the energy with which you move towards the good is tremendously reduced. In the perspective of Wojtyła, the affectivity may be compared to a magnifying glass. It has a cognitive content. It makes you see, and among other things, it makes you see the most important thing, that is the greatness of the human person. You see it, but the magnifying glass, on one hand, helps you to see. On the other hand, puts what you see out of proportion with all other things. And you see in one man, in one woman, you see the greatness of the human person. Against Freud spoke of the over-evaluation of the object of love. Wojtyła, well, sometimes he has one sentence that might seem similar, but in principle, he thinks exactly the contrary. The affection allows you to see the greatness of the human person, but only in one person. And then you must be able to see the beauty in all other persons. I have discovered the greatness of femininity in Maria Pia, but I know, and I must try to know more and more, that that greatness is present in all women, although my privileged access to the mystery of femininity goes through one woman. And then you have this juxtaposition. The will must be, in the end, if need be, led only by the love of God. On the other hand, I must do all what I can in order never to leave the will be led only by the intellect to the love of God, but to accompany this with all the richness of the emotional experience that I make in my everyday life. And this leads Wojtyła also to another point. I think here there is an innovation that is not contrary to von Hildebrand, but I don't see this in Wojtyła, in von Hildebrand, equally developed. And this is the idea of the complexes of affections. In the beginning of this session, there was an image. It was a painting. The painting was the encounter of Dante with Beatrice, the first encounter of Dante with Beatrice. And it is described by Dante in the Vita Nuova, and there is a wonderful sonnet. My lady looks so gentle and so pure. When I was very young, as a teenager, I discovered in myself the impulses of sex, and that poem put a connection between the idea of sex or femininity and the idea of beauty. And he gave me a perspective, a way of looking at women. All boys look at girls, that's normal. But I started looking at girls in a different way. And there was a very good priest, a great friend of mine, Don Francesco Ricci, who used to talk to us and to say to us, yes, you have to watch girls. Of course you have to. But first, the heart and the head, then all the rest. That is, we create an association of emotions related to the physical sphere, emotions that are typical of the psychic sphere, and emotions that pertain to the spiritual sphere. They're not separated from one another. They are connected to one another. And the task of education connect them in such a way that they are all happy, because every one of them finds its proper place under the direction of the spiritual sphere. Reason does not lead our actions without going through affectivity. Yes, under very particular circumstances, this may happen. But the normality of the ethical life is that I react, not because I spend 10 hours thinking, what should I do? And I consult a moral theologian, a philosopher, and so forth, in order to understand what I should do. No, normally I live reacting out of the heart. But the heart, and that's the reason why I like the title of this section, the heart as the synthesis of the person, because the heart is not without reason, but it is not pure reason. If you see a child who is being brutalized, beaten, or a woman, you react. You don't stop and think, should I react or should I not react? Is a good reason to do it, not to do it? No, you react out of the heart. But if you do that, this means that your heart has been educated. And there is a complex of emotions that are connected with one another in your heart in a proper way. And the proper way in which they are connected creates your unique personality. And also, to a certain extent, national types. If you have learned the value of femininity reading Dante, it will not be exactly the same with Shakespeare, the monologue of Romeo, or Hildebrand, or Goethe. Yes, the fundamental value will be the same, but the way in which they are connected with one another will be different. And of course, I love literature. Most people don't learn through literature. They learn through watching the way in which the father considers the mother, or in the relation with the sisters, if they have the fortune of having sisters. I have two. Or learning from one another, or learning from a good priest like Don Francesco for us, or. So that's the reason why, and this is an aspect that I think could easily be integrated within the vision of von Hildebrand, although I have the impression that in him, this idea that there is a connection between physical, psychological, and spiritual values. Well, now and then you can find hints, but I don't think it is so developed. You don't find it so much in love and responsibility, but rather in the acting person. I think this is very important because it gives you a key to the idea that is it possible that I have a duty to love? Is duty and love in an absolute opposition to one another? In one sense, yes. You cannot command your heart. If you have not certain feelings, you just do not have them. On the other hand, it is not quite so, because you can educate your heart. How do you educate your heart? Well, prayer is a way of educating the heart. I come originally from a very lay and anti-Catholic backstage, familiar tradition, and I have read Dante. But most young men who come from Catholic families, I imagine, learn this not so much through Beatrice, but through the Holy Virgin, the prayer to the Virgin. For Polish people, the Apel Jasnogórski, the prayer to the Virgin of Jasna Góra, is a fundamental emotional center that articulates many spheres of life, among them also family life. Prayer is a way of you may ask God, please help me to love this person. I cannot. There's a beautiful song of a great friend of mine. It was a great Italian singer, Claudio Chieffo, who says, well, I shall not translate all the song, but it is a prayer. God, give me the capacity of loving her with the same love with which you love her. Although I cannot, I am not capable. And it happens, and if you have been married for almost 50 years, well, you know that there are times in which it seems that love has died away. And nevertheless, it is not true. There is a super actual attitude that remains also in the moments in which, in the situation of the moment, you will rather kill her. And you have to rekind, you can rekind this. It is a way of thinking, of memory, going back with the memory to the places and moments that have been important for your life together. And because there is a difference between an uneducated affectivity and an educated affectivity. And the process of education, to a very large extent, is a process of education of the affectivity. There are moments in which well, you just have not to do anything. They are the moment in which the other side of the vision of Wojtyła takes the front stage. There are moments in which you have, in your marriage, in which you have just to be like in your marriage, in your relation to your friends, with your children. And you must be like Mary Magdalene, Mary and John under the cross. What should we do? We don't know. What should we do? Nothing. You have just to stay here. Don't move. Don't go away. Stay. And the Lord will resurrect. And love will be born again in your heart. I have gone too far. I stop here. I hope I have made it clear the reasons why Wojtyła has this different approach.
Well, thank you, Rocco, very much. We have just a few minutes here, and Maria, maybe I will give you the floor for a moment if you want to offer any immediate thoughts that you have in response to Rocco, and if we have a minute, we'll take a question or two from the audience.
I thought everything that Rocco said was very important and very helpful with Karol. I mean, that pastoral aspect, and especially dealing with the young. And then I think, you know, later one definitely sees that development also, how the integration of the body. I mean, I think he does such a beautiful job in showing how it all can point together to love, and delves into that more than maybe Hildebrand even does in part. I think that for me, really, very striking is just the gift, I mean, which is for John Paul II, the hermeneutical key to unlocking, you know, everything, is that gift, I think, would be a very nice bridge or way to sort of navigate back and forth between the two authors. But yes, thank you, Rocco. I would love to talk with you more. I feel pressured by time. Otherwise, I have my own questions, but John Henry, I don't know if you want to get some of the questions from the audience.
Well, yes, I will. I'm going to maybe give one one or two if we have time. I don't want to run over too much. We can do it just a little bit. There are so many here. The one thing I want to say to the audience is that we are harvesting your questions. And I think that these questions, which we have in tremendous abundance, will be the basis of our closing panel on Friday. So we will give them again to the faculty, and they'll have also more time to think about them. That way your questions are not just sent into cyberspace and left unanswered. There are themes in these questions. There are a number of questions about the education of the heart, maybe in an effort not to go down a technical path, because there are also questions about, you know, the relationship of intellect and will and heart. We can just close again on that note. Maria, I know you often speak about this issue of the education of the heart, the respect in which the heart is formed by the intellect, the will, what we surround ourselves with. Maybe you could offer just a concluding thought on that. Mine.
I think exposure is so important, isn't it? What Mark said yesterday, you know, that there's beauty in all values. I mean, there is no school of the heart that's better. And that's what, Rocco, I think you were saying, you know, when people learn the school of love from their parents, and then what do you do with broken homes, and what do you do with terrible situations and all the wounds, which I don't think either of the authors really delve into that deeply. But again, and that's where prayer for the Catholic comes in, doesn't it? Because it's exposure to the true and real love, you know, that even transcends, but it's so helpful to see it here in this earth, you know, so that to expose to I mean, a healthy exposure to healthy things all around, you know, but that the personal encounter, that the heart learns most from the exposure and the encounter of the lived commitment to truth in other people. So I can read about it endlessly in a book. I can hear about the lives of the saints, but it just takes one encounter, real encounter between two persons or one person living it, and that pierces the heart, I think, in a tremendous way, and helps to form and educate the heart. So exposure would be my answer. Rocco, what would be your answer?
Well, I beg your pardon, but what came to my mind now is a text of St. Thomas Aquina. So St. Thomas says, nihil potest de potentia deduci in actum, nisi per ali potentia in actum. Nothing moves from potency to act. Nothing is born, if not through the intervention of something in act, which means it is the presence of the saints that excites us in the heart of the people, the will of making the experience of sanctity, not in the technical word of the saints on the altars, but in the sense of a full human maturity. You learn through the contact with somebody who is living. Of course, he's a sinner, he will make mistakes. Later, perhaps you will have occasions to correct him. Nevertheless, in the moment in which you are growing, his presence, her presence, his presence, is what excites the potentialities of your soul and allows you to become a fully mature human being who is capable of loving. We have talked about the parents. I have made also another experience. A young fellow who is 2 or 3 years older than you, sometimes may be more effective in certain moments than your parents and your grandparents. Why? Because he has gone through some experiences you are about to live, and he can lead you more easily. The community of the friends. I remember when I was a very young man, when I got engaged to my present wife, Maria Pia, that's the singer I quoted, Claudio Chiesa. He was 3 years older than me, and he was getting married, and he was a model to me. And in all my life, I have remained closely knit to him and grateful to him for the example he has given to me. So the community of the friends is a tremendous help in which our sentiments are formed and created. Of course, it must be a community in which there is a leadership, a community oriented towards the last destiny of man.
Well, thank you both very much. There are also questions that are coming in requesting sources, texts, that address these questions further, and we will also put these questions to the faculty, and perhaps at the end of the seminar, we can post a list of additional recommended readings or readings that have been discussed in these sessions to the best of our ability. So thank you for those questions. Feel free, please, to continue to request either texts referred to by the audience or by our speakers, or or texts that would further develop points that they're making, and we will try to answer those. I want to mention that the nature of love, which was mentioned many times by Maria in her presentation, is a book that the Hildebrand Project can offer. It can be found, it can be purchased online on Amazon and other booksellers, but we can also provide wholesale orders for those who are interested, and you can visit our website to find out more about how to do that. And by wholesale, we have a very low threshold. We tend to define that as 3 books or more. So if you have a reading group or a parish or a class that you want to purchase books for, please visit our website and you'll learn more about how to do that. You'll find also many other books that the Hildebrand Press itself has published. All of those we can provide in wholesale for those kinds of uses as well. So on that note, Maria and Rocco, I thank you very much. To our audience, we're going to take just a very brief break, and we'll continue with our next session on feeling and knowing. So please don't go away, and we'll be right back.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Rocco.
Thank you, Maria.